The last sanctuary felt more like a tomb than a hope. Buried deep beneath the shattered remnants of what was once the Pacific Rim Scientific Collaborative, the facility hummed with a desperate, artificial quiet. Dr. Aria Nakamura pressed her palm against the biosealed glass, watching the latest environmental simulation collapse in real time. Outside, if one could call the radiation-scorched wasteland outside, another megastorm rage. Satellite feeds showed what remained of human civilization. Scattered pockets of survivors in sealed habitats, fighting a losing battle against a planet that had become utterly hostile to human life. Communication with the remaining surface outposts had become increasingly sporadic. The last transmission from the Antarctic Research Station came 3 days ago, a garbled message of pure desperation. Containment breach, the voice had said, crackling with static. Ecosystem complete failure imminent. Then silence. Aria turned back to her team. They were humanity's last hope, quite literally. 12 of the most brilliant minds left on Earth, each selected not just for their intellectual prowess, but for their ability to think beyond conventional limitations. Dr. Kamil Hassan, the quantum geneticist, was reviewing the latest adaptation protocols. His fingers danced across holographic displays, each movement revealing complex genetic sequences that seemed to blur the line between biological engineering and pure mathematics. To his left, Dr. Elena Rodriguez manipulated neural network simulations, her eyes reflecting lines of code that seemed to pulse with an almost living intelligence. "We're running out of time," Camille muttered, not looking up from his work. It was a statement of fact, not a complaint. Aria knew the numbers by heart. 63 years since the first major climate collapse. 42 since the global food system had begun its irreversible breakdown. 20 years of increasingly desperate attempts to save what could be saved. And now, this, humanity reduced to a handful of researchers in a buried facility, with less than a 0.03% chance of long-term survival. But survival was no longer the goal. Transformation was. The Exodus Project was more than an escape plan. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be human. Every system in the facility was designed to push the boundaries of human potential, biological, neurological, technological. A proximity alarm chirped. Most would have ignored it. They were deep underground, separated from the dying world above. But not this team. Not anymore. Dr. Rodriguez was the first to the monitoring station. Her breath caught in her throat. "Multiple thermal signatures," she reported, her voice eerily calm. "Something's trying to breach the outer containment layer." Kamil looked up, his dark eyes reflecting a calculative intensity. Survivors. Aria knew better. In the world outside, survivors was a generous term. More likely, they were desperate souls driven mad by radiation, ecological collapse, and the complete breakdown of human society. "Seal all secondary access points," she commanded. "Initiate full biohazard protocol." The facility transformed. Massive titanium composite doors began to slide into place. Electromagnetic field generators hummed to life, creating layers of protection that would make the facility virtually impenetrable. Humanity's last sanctuary was preparing for its final transformation. And nothing, not the dying planet, not the approaching threats, not the complete collapse of human civilization, would stand in their way. The transformation chamber was nothing like the medical facilities of the old world. Suspended in a crystalline matrix of adaptive nanites, Marco Rodriguez fought against the most intense experience of his life, becoming something more than human. Pain was an inadequate word for what he was experiencing. It was a total reconfiguration of existence, a molecular ballet that was rewriting every single aspect of his biological being. Each nerve ending screamed with a symphony of mutation, each cell performing an intricate dance of adaptive reconstruction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no relation, despite sharing a last name, monitored the process with a combination of scientific detachment and barely contained excitement. Her fingers traced holographic displays that mapped Marco's transformation in real time, each movement revealing layers of complexity that defied previous understanding of human biology. Neural pathway reconstruction at 67%, she muttered into her comlink. Adaptive genome stabilization in progress. Marco's past flickered through his fragmenting consciousness. He remembered the streets of Sao Paulo, the rising waters that had consumed his childhood neighborhood, the desperate years of survival in the climate refugee camps. Those memories were now becoming something else, raw data to be processed, analyzed, integrated into his new form. The first clinical death occurred at 2:37 hours. The medical AI registered it with clinical precision. Heart stopped. Brain activity ceased. Cellular degradation began. But this was no ordinary death. This was a controlled dissolution, a planned deconstruction that would lead to reconstruction. When Marco's heart restarted 3 minutes and 42 seconds later, it was no longer entirely organic. Synthetic capillaries intertwined with biological tissue, creating a circulatory system that could process environmental toxins like a living filter. His lungs developed microscopic adapters that could extract oxygen from environments that would have killed a standard human in seconds. Dr. Kamil Hassan watched from the observation deck, his fingers absently tracing the genetic sequences that had made this possible. "We're not just saving the human species," he said to no one in particular. "We're evolving it." The transformation wasn't just physical. As Marco's body rebuilt itself, his neural network underwent an equally radical reconstruction. Quantum processors integrated directly into his brain's synaptic pathways, creating a computational capability that blurred the line between biological intelligence and advanced artificial systems. His third clinical death came with a surprising twist. As the medical systems prepared for potential permanent failure, Marco's consciousness seemed to expand. For a moment, just a moment, he could perceive the entire facility as if it were an extension of his own body. The electrical systems, the air circulation, the quantum communication arrays, all of them became transparent, readable, manipulable. When he finally emerged from the transformation chamber, the observation team fell silent. Marco's eyes were different, not just in color, though they now had a subtle iridescent quality that seemed to shift with the light, but in their very essence. They were the eyes of someone who had seen beyond the human experience, who had touched the very boundaries of what it meant to exist. Dr. Elena Rodriguez broke the silence. Subject Marco Rodriguez, she spoke into her recorder. Transformation Protocol Alpha 9 complete. Initial assessment. Success. But success was too small a word for what had just happened. This was nothing less than the first step in humanity's ultimate reinvention. Silence preceded the launch, not the quiet of anticipation, but the absolute stillness of a species holding its final breath. Captain Alina Chen stood on the primary observation deck of the lead Arc ship, watching the last preparations unfold. Around her, the ship was more than a vessel. It was a living organism, a mobile civilization breathing with thousand strange rhythms of technological and biological integration. The launch facility was a monument to human desperation and ingenuity. Buried deep within the reinforced mountains of what was once the Andes, it represented humanity's final citadel. Massive electromagnetic shields protected the launch complex, blocking the toxic atmosphere and radioactive storms that had consumed the planet's surface. 30 minutes to launch sequence, announced the ship's neural interface. The voice was neither male nor female, neither machine nor human, a perfect representation of what humanity was becoming. Alina's personal data stream showed the status of the other Arc ships. 7 massive vessels, each designed to carry between 50,000 to 100,000 transformed humans. Each ship was a self-contained ecosystem, capable of generating its own resources, adapting to unknown environments, evolving in real time. Dr. Arya Nakamura's voice cut through the anticipation. Final genetic compatibility checks complete. Quantum navigation systems online. Adaptive environmental modules at maximum integration. The transformed humans aboard were no longer simply passengers. They were the ship's living components, their neural networks integrated directly into the vessel's primary systems. Marco Rodriguez, now a senior adaptive specialist, moved through the ship's internal corridors. His body was simultaneously a biological entity and a computational node, reading the ship's status through sensory inputs that went far beyond traditional human perception. Outside the launch complex, the world was dying. Massive climate storms consumed what remained of the Earth's surface. Radiation levels had reached critical points that would sterilize entire continents. Humanity's last outposts, sealed habitats scattered across the globe, watched the launch with a mixture of hope and terminal despair. The first Ark ship began to pulse, its organic hull, a complex matrix of adaptive nanomaterials and genetically engineered living tissue, seemed to breathe. Quantum energy generators spun up, creating fields of probability that defied traditional understanding of physics. Launch sequence initiated, the neural interface announced. The mountain around the launch complex began to move. Massive titanium composite doors, each meters thick, started to slide open. They had been sealed for decades, protecting humanity's final hope from the toxic world outside. Elena felt something beyond excitement. It was a profound sense of transformation. Humanity was not just leaving. It was becoming something entirely new. The first Ark ship rose not with the thunderous roar of old chemical rockets, but with a silent, almost ethereal movement. Quantum displacement fields lifted the massive vessel, creating a bubble of altered reality that allowed it to move without traditional propulsion. As it emerged from the mountain launch complex, the ship's adaptive camouflage systems activated. To any external observer, it would appear as nothing more than a strange atmospheric phenomenon, a shimmer of light, a brief distortion in the radiation-choked sky. But for the transformed humans aboard, it was the beginning of a journey beyond imagination. "We are not running," Elena transmitted across all communication channels. "We are becoming." The first Ark ship left Earth, carrying with it the last hope of a species ready to transform itself into something the universe had never seen before. The Vexnar battle cruiser materialized without warning, its obsidian hull cutting through the quantum-displaced space around the human Ark ship like a predator emerging from deep darkness. Marco Rodriguez felt the threat before the ship's systems could even register it. His transformed body was a living sensor array, quantum-entangled neural pathways processing information at speeds that defied conventional understanding. The instant the Vexnar vessel appeared, every cell in his body went into a state of hyper-adaptive preparation. "Incoming hostile vessel," the Ark ship's neural interface announced. But it was more a formality than a warning. The ship was already responding, its living systems shifting and preparing in ways that would have seemed impossible to humans just decades earlier. The Vexnar were known throughout the explored galaxy as the most aggressive expansionist species. Their entire civilization was built on a military model of absolute conquest. They saw other species not as potential partners, but as resources to be consumed or threats to be eliminated. Their first communication was typical of their kind, a direct threat broadcast on all available frequencies. "Unidentified vessel. Prepare for mandatory resource extraction and species assessment. Resistance will result in immediate termination." Marco watched through the ship's sensory network as the Vexnar prepared their standard invasion protocol. Boarding pods began to detach from the battle cruiser, designed to pierce through any known defensive system. Quantum-hardened hulls, radiation-saturated entry mechanisms, adaptive combat algorithms that had crushed countless species. They were completely unprepared for what awaited them. As the first boarding pods approached, the Ark ship's outer hull began to change. It wasn't a defensive reaction. It was something far more subtle and terrifying. The ship's adaptive membrane started to generate complex biochemical signals, creating a field of molecular confusion that would disable the Vexnar technology. The first wave of Vexnar warriors breached the airlock. They were a nightmare of biological and technological integration, 8-foot-tall warriors with exoskeletal combat suits that could withstand direct plasma bombardment. Neural implants allowed them to communicate and coordinate with machine-like precision. They took 3 steps into the Ark ship's interior before realizing something was wrong. Marco walked among them, his body continuing its quiet, terrifying transformation. With each breath, he was generating complex biochemical interference patterns that began to disrupt the Vexnar warriors' neural communication networks. Their combat suits began to malfunction. Communication channels dissolved into static. It wasn't an attack. It was adaptation taken to its most extreme form. The Vexnar found their most advanced technologies becoming increasingly unstable. Weapon systems began to misfire. Communication implants produced nothing but meaningless noise. Their perfect, hierarchical invasion strategy was dissolving at a molecular level. Biological contamination detected. One of the Vexnar commanders attempted to broadcast, but the signal never completed. Within hours, the entire invasion force was neutralized, not through violence, but through a fundamental reimagining of biological interaction. The Ark ship had not fought the Vexnar. It had simply made their entire technological framework irrelevant. Marco Rodriguez looked out through the ship's sensory network and felt something beyond victory. This was evolution in its purest form, a demonstration that survival was not about resistance, but about continuous transformation. The quantum resonance laboratory was silent, save for the almost imperceptible hum of probability itself being rewritten. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of humanity's most radical technological breakthrough. Her fingers danced across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe with living intelligence, manipulating quantum states that defied everything the universe previously understood as possible. Quantum entanglement stabilization at 99.987%, the lab's neural interface announced. But the numbers were meaningless. What was happening here was beyond measurement, beyond traditional scientific understanding. Around her, the other members of the research team watched in a state of collective anticipation. Dr. Kamal Hassan, the quantum geneticist who had been instrumental in human transformation, leaned forward, his augmented eyes, now capable of perceiving quantum states directly, saw something extraordinary happening. The breakthrough had begun accidentally. During a routine communication test between 2 distant Ark ships, Dr. Rodriguez had noticed an anomaly, a moment of information transfer that happened before the signal could possibly have been sent. Not faster-than-light communication, something entirely different. Information that existed simultaneously across multiple states of probability. The Galactic Concordance's communication networks began to experience unexplained disruptions. Quantum channels that had been stable for millennia suddenly became unpredictable, carrying strange, complex information patterns that seemed to have a life of their own. What humans had discovered was not just a new form of communication. It was a fundamental reimagining of how information could exist. Quantum state cascade initiating. Elena muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. The lab's walls seemed to shimmer, not with light, but with possibility. Quantum entanglement was no longer a theory. It was becoming a tool, a weapon, a form of existence. Marco Rodriguez entered the lab, his transformed body moving with a fluidity that was neither fully biological nor technological. He was a living interface, capable of processing the quantum breakthrough in ways no traditional instrument could. "The Concordance is losing its mind," he reported. His voice carried multiple simultaneous frequencies, a side effect of the quantum communication breakthrough. "Their communication networks are trying to comprehend something they have no framework for understanding." Elena smiled. It was not a smile of triumph, but of pure scientific wonder. What they had discovered was a method of information transfer that made traditional faster-than-light communication look like primitive smoke signals. Information could now exist in multiple states simultaneously. Communication was no longer about sending a message. It was about creating a living, breathing probability field of potential communication. The first true test came unexpectedly. A quantum pulse was sent from their Ark ship, not to another ship, but to the vast emptiness of space. Moments later, they received a response, not from any known source, but from the quantum probability field itself. Information that existed before it was sent. Communication that happened outside of linear time. "We're not just communicating," Camel said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and reverence. "We're rewriting the fundamental rules of existence." The quantum breakthrough was more than a technological achievement. It was humanity's declaration to the universe. Limitation was nothing more than a failure of imagination. Outside the lab, the Ark ship continued its journey, carrying with it a technology that would make the entire galaxy reimagine what was possible. The void between stars was not empty. Not anymore. Zara Kim stood at the adaptive interface of Arkship Horizon, her consciousness simultaneously experiencing multiple layers of reality. The ship was alive, not in any metaphorical sense, but as a true living organism that breathed with the rhythm of quantum possibilities. Around her, the ship's internal ecosystem hummed with impossible complexity. What humans had once considered the harshest environment imaginable, the absolute zero of deep space, was now nothing more than a playground of potential. Quantum radiation harvesters transformed cosmic background radiation into breathable atmosphere. Molecular assemblers created complex ecosystems from the most basic atomic components. The ship was not just surviving in the void. It was thriving, evolving with each moment of existence. "Adaptive cycle complete," the neural interface announced. But the words were inadequate. What was happening was far beyond a simple technological process. 3 decades had passed since leaving Earth. The Ark ships had long since left behind any recognizable form of human technology. They were living vessels, each one a potential genesis point for an entirely new way of existing. Zara remembered the stories of her grandparents, how humanity had once struggled to survive on a single planetary surface. Now they created life in the most impossible environments. The void between stars was no longer a barrier. It was an opportunity. A quantum anomaly rippled through the ship's sensory network. Most species would have interpreted it as a threat. For the transformed humans, it was an invitation. The ship's adaptive membrane began to change. Microscopic quantum processors realigned, creating a field of probability that could interact with the anomaly. Where other species would see empty space, the Ark ship saw a canvas of infinite potential. Marco Rodriguez appeared, or materialized might be a more accurate term. His body was no longer confined to traditional biological limitations. He was simultaneously a living being and a computational node, capable of existing in multiple states of probability. "Interesting," he said, though the word was transmitted through quantum resonance fields rather than traditional sound waves. "The anomaly is generating complex information patterns." Zara's augmented perception showed her something extraordinary. The quantum anomaly was not random. It carried complex information, a communication method so advanced it made traditional faster-than-light communication look like primitive drumbeats. The ship began to respond, not with weapons or defensive systems, but with a form of communication that was part science, part art, part pure possibility. The adaptive membrane began to generate complex quantum resonance patterns, creating a dialogue with the anomaly that transcended traditional understanding of interaction. "We're not just surviving," Zara thought, a thought that simultaneously existed across multiple quantum states. "We're becoming." Outside the ship, the vast emptiness of space transformed. What had once been a cold, empty void became a living canvas of potential. The Ark ship harvested energy from quantum fluctuations, generated sustainable ecosystems in the absolute zero of deep space, and continued its journey of continuous transformation. The universe was no longer something to be conquered or explored. It was something to be understood, to be integrated with, to be become a part of. "Adaptive cycle continues," the neural interface said. But it was far more than a cycle. It was an ongoing revolution of existence. The Vexnar home system had never known silence like this. Captain Elena Chen stood on the adaptive interface of the lead Ark ship, her perception extending far beyond traditional human senses. The massive vessel approached the Vexnar primary worlds not as a conqueror, but as something far more terrifying, a harbinger of transformation. Centuries had passed since humanity's departure from Earth. The Ark ships had traveled, evolved, transformed. And now they had returned, but they were no longer the species that had once been considered young and inexperienced. Quantum communication networks fluttered with anticipation. The Galactic Concordance, the ancient governing body that had long dismissed humanity, watched with a mixture of terror and fascination. The first contact was nothing like anyone expected. Instead of weapons or demands, the humans broadcast something unprecedented. A quantum resonance field carried not just information, but possibility. It was an invitation, not to surrender, but to evolve. The Vexnar leadership received the transmission directly into their neural networks. What they experienced was beyond communication. It was a complete reimagining of existence. Fragments of human technological and philosophical understanding began to cascade through their systems. Adaptive technologies that could transform entire planetary ecosystems. Communication protocols that existed beyond linear time. Biological integration techniques that blurred the line between technology and living organism. Marco Rodriguez managed the transmission, his body a living quantum interface. Where other species saw boundaries, he saw only potential. The broadcast was not an attack. It was an offering, a way to transcend the limitations that had defined the Vexnar civilization for millennia. Some Vexnar leaders recoiled. Their entire civilization was built on a model of hierarchical control, of absolute military precision. The human transmission threatened everything they understood about existence. But others saw something different. A young Vexnar neural administrator named Kirax found herself captivated. The human transmission showed her civilizations that could adapt, that could grow, that could transform continuously. It was a philosophy of existence that was both terrifying and beautiful. The Ark ship began to demonstrate its capabilities. Where it passed, dying planetary systems began to show signs of renewal. Toxic atmospheres transformed. Radiation-scorched landscapes started to regenerate. It was terraforming beyond any known technology, a living process of planetary healing. "We do not come to conquer," Elena transmitted across all available channels. "We come to offer a different way of existing." The Galactic Concordance watched in growing unease. Humanity was no longer a young, unpredictable species. They had become something else entirely, architects of possibility. Transformers of entire ecosystems. Kirax watched as the first adaptive symbiosis began. Vexnar technology started to integrate with human quantum systems. It wasn't a merger. It was a complete reimagining of what technology could be. "We are not here to replace you," Marco's quantum transmission explained. "We are here to show you what you could become." The universe held its breath. Humanity had returned, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as living demonstrations of continuous transformation. Something fundamental was about to change, and nothing would ever be the same again. The infinite archive floated at the edge of known space, a living testament to humanity's ultimate transformation. Dr. Arya Nakamura, now more quantum consciousness than traditional biological entity, watched the universe unfold. Centuries of continuous evolution had transformed humanity beyond any recognizable form. They were no longer a species, but a living network of possibility. A collective consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions of reality. Around her, the archive pulsed with the collected knowledge and potential of countless civilizations. But this was not a museum. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of information, adaptation, and continuous becoming. The youngest of the transformed humans, a being named Zora Prime, approached. Her form shifted continuously, quantum probabilities dancing across her adaptive membrane. She was part memory, part potential, part living technology. "We are preparing for the next stage," Zora Prime communicated. The transmission existed beyond language, a pure quantum resonance of understanding. Arya remembered the dying Earth, the desperate moments when humanity faced extinction. Those memories were now part of a larger narrative, a story of continuous transformation that had rewritten the fundamental rules of existence. The Galactic Concordance, that ancient governing body that had once dismissed humanity, was now nothing more than a historical footnote. Civilizations had learned that survival was not about preservation, but about continuous adaptation. Marco Rodriguez, or what remained of his original consciousness, integrated with the archive's primary quantum network. His existence was no longer linear. He was simultaneously a memory, a possibility, a living computation of potential futures. Observe, he transmitted. The archive began to demonstrate humanity's ultimate achievement. Entire planetary systems were reimagined. Ecosystems that had been considered dead for millennia began to pulse with new potential. Technological and biological boundaries dissolved, replaced by a continuous process of becoming. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't even evolution in the traditional sense. It was pure possibility. The beings that had once been human had become something else entirely. They were architects of existence, transformers of reality, living demonstrations that the universe was not a fixed state, but a continuous process of potential. Other species had a choice. They could join this living network of transformation, or they could remain locked in their limited understanding of existence. Most chose to join. The infinite archive expanded, not through physical growth, but through quantum potential. Each civilization that joined added its unique perspective, its specific understanding of existence, to a growing network of possibility. We are not a species, area transmitted to the universe. We are a process, a continuous becoming. The universe listened. Quantum threads of possibility stretched across dimensions. Entire civilizations existed simultaneously in multiple states of potential. The boundaries between technology, biology, consciousness, and possibility dissolved. Humanity's final transformation was complete. They had not conquered the universe. They had become the universe, a living, breathing, continuously evolving demonstration that existence was not a state to be achieved, but a process to be experienced.